You're listening to the Grace Plus Zero podcast, exploring the crossroads of culture, faith, and family from a biblical worldview. And now your host.
Imagine yourself in a position where you fall on hard times. You sell everything that you have. You don't have any land. You don't have any possessions. You're going to be looking forward to the year of Jubilee if you're that person. The last two episodes we've talked about Jubilee, and today we're going to mention Jubilee just a little bit. We're going to also cover some news, Bible facts, American history, and parting shots. But we also want to close up and mention a few things about Jubilee that we weren't able to get into the last episode. And we appreciate you for tuning in. My name is Brian Moore, and you're listening to Grace Plus Zero. Welcome to episode 9. Today's show, we're going to talk a little bit about Jubilee, wrap it up. But before we do that, I just want to remind you that you can catch our podcast on any source, for example, like iTunes, Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean, Podchaser, wherever it is that you get your podcast fix. We recommend that you download the Spreaker widget or the Spreaker player on your phone and catch it there. You can go to our Spreaker page. It's Grace Plus Zero. You can download and subscribe to our RSS feed right there and get it straight to your iPad or phone or whatever it is, device that you listen to your podcasts on. Also like to remind you to visit us on Twitter at Grace Plus Zero. That's one word. Also on Facebook at Grace Plus Zero. And you can catch us also, or send us an email, at gpzpodcast@gmail.com. All right, this week's show, we're going to be wrapping up, talking just a few more minutes about Jubilee, our History Matters segment. We're going to talk about the separation of church and state. We're going to mention 4 or 5 news stories that are pretty interesting that took place this past week. And we've got some Bible facts to throw at you as well as parting shots. So the last couple of weeks we've talked about Jubilee and everything that, not everything, of course, there's no way we could possibly touch on all of it. There's just so many wonderful things about the year of Jubilee that we could, get into. And we talked about quite a few things last week, just kind of, sharing some of our thoughts about some different aspects of it. But there was a few things that we didn't get to mention there at the end of the program that we just wanted to kind of wrap everything up, put a little bow on it, and move forward. And today we're going to talk about those things. We mentioned, of course, last week we talked about how the system, God's system, is much more perfect than any system that man has. We have, for the last couple hundred years, capitalism has dominated the world. We've also always had this scare of socialism, and it's been here and there. We've had mercantilism, a lot of different types of economic systems. We've got market economies, which I don't even know if there's a free market economy anywhere in the world right now today. You've got mixed economies. You've got all of these different ideas, and everything is, trying to, all these are ideas, economically speaking, that people have tried to implement to make things better for everyone across the board. And I've always argued that the best system that we have as far on earth that man has ever come up with, I would have to argue, is capitalism. Capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any system ever in the world. It doesn't involve theft the same way that socialism does. But at the same time, there's elements of things that are not perfect with either one of those systems. And sometimes under capitalism, especially if it's unfettered, you can see gross amounts of wealth and land accumulated in the hands of a small group of people, and this could lead to feudalism or some type of oligarchical control or power. The system that God has is much, much better. And we were talking at the end of the program the other day. Just imagine yourself in a position where you fell on hard times. If you were in the Old Testament, now we're going back to Leviticus chapter 25. You had sold everything that you had, try to make ends meet. You didn't have any land. You had no place to really call home. you would be in a very tough predicament. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you would know that Jubilee is coming. You would know that the day would come in which you would be set free. That's a beautiful thought to have. It's the same way with God's children here on earth. I don't profess that this world is my home. I believe that my home is a place called heaven because there's a part of me that came from there. And I believe there's a part of me that longs to go back to that place called heaven. And although there's elements of this world that we love, there's people that we love, there's a lot of bad, miserable things about this world. And we have that precious hope that one day all of those things that discourage us, all those things that drag us down, all those things that make us miserable, all of those things will pass away and we have a better day to look forward to. And that's the message of the gospel. And we have that to look forward to because of the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. And when Jubilee comes in the morning, when that trumpet sounds, it's going to be a sound and a day and a moment unlike anything we've ever heard before. Let's go back to that just a minute. The clean start that we talked about. Oftentimes in life when we get along here, you offend someone, you upset someone, make a bad mistake, you don't get a do-over. Jubilee was sort of like a do-over. We mentioned that in the last episode. But as fun, as enjoyable as that could be, there is so many spiritual applications to this. And if you go to Romans chapter 8, verse 8, I want to mention this real quick. Out of all of the systems in the Old Testament law, the children of Israel had something better than anything that you and I could have ever came up with. God's wisdom is perfect. His system is perfect. And anytime you look at how the Lord God governed His people and His rules, they would have always been better off if they had adhered to His rules. It's the same for you and I today. What happens now when people inherit stuff from one generation to generation? What happens to them? The wealth accumulates in a few hands. The government decides they're going to take big chunks of it. And they build up, and basically they build up a ruling class. Everyone would agree that our government and any and all governments around the world are corrupt. To what level or degree, there's no way to, I guess, measure that. But government is corrupt by nature. But government is force. And sometimes, like in the past, especially, you read about medieval Europe and stuff, under feudalism, some of those governments had so much overarching power that people were oppressed. Thankfully, we don't have anything like that. The only system that would, actually work and actually did work for the children of Israel was God's system. And that those people, they had private property, but it was property that they had inherited. The thing about it's really interesting for me about the morning of the Jubilee or the year of the Jubilee in the Bible is that there is coming a Jubilee morning, and as in the days of old, the trumpet would sound all throughout the land and proclaim liberty to all the captives. There is going to be a moment, a day that's coming in the future where a trumpet is going to sound. And when that trumpet sounds, Christ is going to come in the clouds, and the eastern sky is going to part, and we're going to experience a Jubilee unlike anything that we have ever imagined. Our minds can't even comprehend it. But in the book of Romans, in the 8th chapter, this is what it says. Remember the year of Jubilee. You know what Jubilee is? Jubilee is liberty. Remember that Jubilee is coming. When you get discouraged and when you fall on hard times, when your pain, your misery, and your suffering, your depression, or whatever it is, reaches a point to where you don't think you can get past it. Remember, Jubilee is coming. You have an inheritance that is incorruptible and undefiled, that fadeth not away. God sent His only begotten Son down here to groan, bleed, and die on the cross of Calvary. And He has made us a promise that He would go away and that He would come back again. And when He does, He's going to receive us unto Himself. And then we will experience a Jubilee unlike anything we can ever comprehend. We'll be back after these messages. All right, welcome back to the show. American history. History matters. I say this every week about this time. History matters. You know what we got to do? We need to confront the uncomfortable fact that for much of American history, there is a phrase that has absolutely been misused, abused, misapplied, taken out of context, and has taken on an entire life of its own, and that is a phrase, separation of church and state. Why should we care about that particular phrase? I'm going to tell you why. It has been used to silence people. It's been used to silence communities, in particularly communities of faith. It's been used to exclude people from full participation in public life. Why should we even worry about it? Well, we should care because this wall that we're talking about here, getting ready to talk about, this wall of separation of church and state, is being used basically to separate religion from public life. It's being used to basically promote a religion that is so private and a state that is so secular that the two basically cannot even coexist in the eyes of some people. Now, this particular viewpoint would have alarmed our founding fathers. George Washington, I use him as an example, in regards to religion. He said that religion was an indispensable support for social order and political prosperity. When de Tocqueville came to America and observed America, one of the things that he noticed that was very interesting, you see, most of you are aware of American history. The French Revolution came shortly thereafter. And the French Revolution was much, much different. They hoped that it would turn out the way ours did, but it didn't. De Tocqueville determined that one of the things that he observed was he was almost astonished by the fact that there wasn't, we'll say, police officers, or there wasn't someone on every street corner monitoring the people. I mean, after all, how is it possible that the people can be free to do as they choose and yet be nice or benevolent to one another? De Tocqueville determined that through his observations that the reason that was possible in America is because the people were governed not by a gun, not by a military, but they were governed by something much greater. They were governed by their morality and their allegiance to the God of the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in America was a born-again Christian, going to church, 2 or 3 days a week. That doesn't mean that. But the society that those people lived in had reverence and respect for the morality and the laws that were inscribed in the Bible. And Thomas Jefferson is where this particular quote comes from, separation of church and state. And we're going to talk just about it here just for a second, but I would like to mention another thing about de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville noticed something very interesting. Sunday morning roll around, almost every man, woman, and child to a person was finding a place to go to church. And people believed naturally in freedom and in liberty, but they also believed that in order to be able to maintain that freedom and that liberty, that they had to respect others. And these teachings that they received came from the Bible. So America had a very unique experiment, and that experiment has been ongoing for a little over 240 years now. And de Tocqueville argued that some of the reasons was due to our allegiance to our faith and the biblical teachings which people followed in their communities. Thomas Jefferson had written a letter to the Danbury Baptists. They had actually written a letter to him, and they were concerned. Thomas Jefferson was around 1801 when this happened. They wrote this letter to him, and in this particular letter, they were a little bit concerned that a state religion might be established. And due to the fact that a state religion might be established, they were afraid that it was going to infringe upon their religious liberty. And Thomas Jefferson set out to show them through his letter, and you can pull this letter up online, you can look at it and read it. He replied to them in his letter to not basically be alarmed about this, because there was a firm wall of separation of church and state in America. In other words, Jefferson basically said the federal government is on one side of this wall and the church is on the other side. And you will hear a lot of people today that will use this particular argument to say that you can't pray in public, that you can't have days of Thanksgiving, you can't have holidays, you can't have the Ten Commandments posted in a public facility or a building. A football team and a coach can't pray on the sidelines or before a football game because he's employed by the state. That has absolutely nothing to do with what Jefferson was referencing. Jefferson now, and the reason some people say this is because Jefferson was of the persuasion that the federal government, matter of fact, when Jefferson was president, some people considered him anti-religious because he did not want to institute federal holidays that respected any type of religion. Now, on the contrary, he had no problem whatsoever with the state doing that. He had no problem with the state of Virginia doing that. He had no problem with the state of Massachusetts doing it. He just did not believe the federal government should do it. And for that reason, some people look at him and they say, oh, well, this is what Jefferson meant. Jefferson had no problem attending church in the Capitol building, which was a federal facility. He attended church there. I'm pretty sure that if he had a problem with that and he thought that was a violation of the separation of church and state, that he would have immediately stopped it. That's not what Jefferson was referencing in his letter. In his letter, and context is important, in his letter he was explaining to these people, the Danbury Baptists, that they had nothing to fear from the federal government. The government was not going to establish a religion. And that's a very important understanding, because if you read the Bill of Rights, and this is something that a lot of people, this is a little nugget, and it's a little bit of an argument that you can present to someone from a Christian apologetic viewpoint. The Bill of Rights says that the government cannot establish nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. So I'm going to give you a scenario and show you what I'm talking about. Let's say, for example, and this has actually happened, a football coach was praying with his football team, and some atheists took offense to it, so they decided that that was a violation of the separation of church and state, which, by the way, is only found in a letter, not in the Constitution. I'll say that again. It's found in a letter, not in the Constitution. Okay, so this coach does this, and they're arguing that it's a violation of the separation of church and state. Well, what does the Constitution say? The Constitution says that Congress cannot establish a religion, nor can it prohibit the free exercise thereof. Is a coach praying with his team Congress establishing religion? No, it is not. Absolutely is not. Congress did not establish anything. Is putting the Ten Commandments up in the town hall, is that a violation of the First Amendment? Of course not. Congress did not establish that as a law. if you look at it from this perspective, it's very easy to debunk all of these arguments. When Congress establishes a religion, that will be a violation. And until it happens, it's not a violation. So it's just another way of looking at it. But when Thomas Jefferson said that there was a wall of separation, it is one of the most misused metaphors that has ever probably attributed to Thomas Jefferson out of everything that the man ever did. And it's very unfortunate today that we have to put up with these types of misunderstandings and these misapplied arguments. But the simple fact is, Jefferson and the whole context of what was happening there, what he said had absolutely nothing to do with you and I praying in a public building, taking your Bible to school, and so forth. We'll be back right after this. All right, we've got some interesting Bible facts we're going to share with you today. Not a ton of them, but these have to do with age, and I think you'll find some of these interesting. You know, have you ever heard the old saying, so-and-so is old as dirt? Well, I've heard it too, and I've actually said it, and now I'm starting to feel it sometimes, but nonetheless, we'll move forward. But there are some people in the Bible that live to be a very ripe old age. Methuselah, the oldest man ever lived in the Bible, 969 years old. You can find that in the 5th chapter of the book of Genesis. 969 years old. There were 6 other people who in the Bible who lived over 900 years. Adam lived to be 930 years, and that's in the 5th chapter of the book of Genesis also. I think it's Genesis 5:5. Seth, his son, lived to be 912 years. Enos, or in some cases Enosh, he lived to be 905 years. That's in Genesis 5 also. You can go to Genesis 5 and get all of these except for the last one. Canaan in the Bible lived to be 910 years old. Jared lived to be 962 years old. And then Noah. In Genesis chapter 9, we learn that Noah lived to be 950 years old. Really interesting nugget about that. We'll talk about it, give you something to maybe look up and take a look at, is the young earth creation theory that explains the vapor shield that was around the earth and how that particular vapor shield would have impacted carbon decay. I know I'm getting into a really deep topic here, but it would have impacted the rate of carbon decay significantly had there been a vapor shield around the earth. And in addition to that, not only would it affect the rate at which carbon decayed, but it would also affect the rate of how long things lived and so forth. But after the flood, after Noah, you'll realize that people no longer lived that long anymore. This particular theory that I'm talking about suggests that the reason that was the case is because that vapor shield was gone. Because you remember, the water came from the heavens and the water came from the deep. Suppose that vapor shield burst and the earth was flooded. Interesting theory, and we'll talk about it one day. We're going to dedicate a portion of a show to it, but it's something for you to check out. 6 people, aside from Methuselah, 969 years old, 6 others in the Bible lived over 900 years. All right, welcome back to the show. We got some news for you, a lot of Christian news in the headlines, I should say, from a Christian perspective. This is a big one here. A school has punished a 6th grader for one of the most egregious things that could possibly have ever happened. This young man used the wrong pronoun. That is correct, folks. He used the wrong pronoun for a transgender student. According to an Ohio public, Christian headlines, an Ohio public school punished a 6th grader after he used the wrong pronoun. for a transgender student. Basically told his friends that the particular student was a boy and not a girl. And according to the Christian legal group, which is called Liberty Counsel, that's all it took to get the young man brought down to the office. At issue here is a biological boy who says that he's a girl, and he wrote to the school district telling them that this particular young man said these things about him. It happened during art class back in May. And a lot of other kids in the class evidently went perfectly right along with it. And a lot of them started talking, and then some other students kind of started talking negatively about it. And one thing led to another, and this young man overheard it, and he said, doesn't matter, he's a boy, he's not a girl, and next thing you know, we're in court. Art teacher overheard part of the argument, and she reported what she knew to the assistant principal. And the principal told him this is just crazy. Says you can have your own beliefs, but if he wants to be a girl, he's a girl. What was the young man's punishment? Well, he had to sit in the office. He was embarrassed, basically. He had to sit out of his gym class. He had to sit on the side while the kids played. And because he used the wrong pronoun, he was punished, and now the First Amendment, at least the Liberty Counsel, is saying the First Amendment rights were violated of the student. So this is going on to a court case, and this is just, I don't know. They realized, I think the school later realized that they probably should not have punished the young man because, I mean, after all, he used a pronoun. And this is just another example of trying to control language. Just a terribly ridiculous story, but it is from American headlines. It's something that's very real and something that has happened. Another story in the news coming out of this week, Mario Lopez from Saved by the Bell. Some of you may remember him from your childhood. He is now a reporter for Access Hollywood. And during a particular program, forum, I think that he was taking part in, he made some comments. And Lopez, his comment was, look, I'm never one to tell anyone how to parent their kids. But at the same time, if you're 3 years old and you're saying you're feeling a certain way, or you think you're a boy or a girl, whatever the case may be, I just think it's dangerous as a parent to make that determination then. What was Lopez talking about? Well, he was talking with Candace Owens on this particular, on the Candace Owens show, a forum that she had put together. And he was talking about a child that was 3 years old, and their parents said that this particular child at 3 was saying that they were the opposite sex of what they are. And of course, according to the parent, they were going to let the child make this decision. And because he made this comment, the outrage from the left was just unbelievable. Next thing you know, here's a guy clawing and scratching and hoping for his job. And as a matter of fact, as of this recording, his show, his future on the show is still in jeopardy. So what did Lopez do? After being, called a transphobe and all these other things, he within 24 hours issued an apology to all these different groups. He did it publicly on Twitter and on Facebook, and in a lot of ways, I feel like he maybe sold out to the pressure of everything that was going on, because what he said was entirely reasonable. There was nothing wrong with it. This is the culture that this particular movement wants to create. They want to create a culture in which anyone who says anything negatively or anything objectively about this particular movement will be raked over the coals and criticized. And I'm telling you, they do not care whose career is destroyed. They do not care at what expense their their freedom or their viewpoint comes across. There is no person who is bigger than their movement, and they're willing to sacrifice anyone on their altar. And it appears that Mario Lopez is the most recent one to suffer at this altar. And what did he do? Well, he spoke the truth, and in this day and time, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act, apparently. Another story coming up here, I think this one is in South Carolina. A judge banned prayer and religious music at all graduations. Why did he do so? Well, according to U.S. District Judge Bruce Howell Hendricks, in Greenville County schools, they knowingly allowed prayer from a student during a graduation. And he says, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about Thomas Jefferson, this is a violation of separation of church and state. It clearly is not. But it wasn't good enough that it happened there. It had to happen everywhere. Why? To appease an atheist. If you haven't figured out in the last couple of headlines here what's happening, if the squeaky wheel always gets the grease. And what we're seeing here more and more often is this small, very, very small segment of society that continues to basically rant about anything that is moral, anything that is rationally based, anything that is religious, anything that is associated with Christianity, and they try to tear it down by protesting and stopping everything. And what's very interesting about this is most people, don't think much about this. They just sit back. And what's happening is incrementally, bit by bit, they continue to gain a little bit more ground. And the people who say these things, the people who think these things, the people who have religious sentiment, the people who have religious feelings and emotions, and people who want to objectively make statements about children like Mario Lopez did, those people are crawling into a shell and they're remaining silent. This is exactly how things happened in the 1930s in a place called Germany. Fear of being, ostracized, fear of losing your job, fear of all of these things is pushing people into silence. When you have this, there is no such thing as free speech. There's coming a time we're going to have to start speaking up. As always, we like to end the news segment with a couple of really good, positive stories. And in this particular story, a local church in Hillsboro, Kansas, basically donated enough school supplies for all students in an elementary school in grades kindergarten through 5. And they got together, they created backpacks and school supplies, and they donated every single student in the school with supplies for the upcoming school year. Just another example of that kingdom work that I was talking about before. We know that some people do things with an agenda, but if you're doing it from the bottom of your heart, you're doing it because you want to help other people, and you don't want to get any glory for it. It's a very good thing. And in this particular case, a body of believers reached out to help some local students. So it's a great thing. Great thing. And in closing, of course, we mentioned the tragedy in El Paso and the tragedy at Dayton, the senseless acts of violence. Some El Paso churches got together. A lot of different churches got together and agreed to give blood and counseling, and they got together and prayed for the shootings of these mass shootings that took place in both cities. And it just showed that they were able to put, some differences aside, and whether it be denominational differences or logistical differences, and they came together for a common cause. And when God's people are moved and they pray, things happen. So really good news coming out of El Paso there by several people in that area that are church-going members. And it just says another thing about the positivity of the church in this day and time, and what kind of power it can actually pack. We're getting ready to come up on the close of the show. We're parting shots, and we'll be back right after these messages. With the parting shots, I want to mention one thing in particular. It's very disturbing. With the shootings that took place in El Paso and Dayton, and of course the stabbings that took place in California last week, there's all types of common similarities or coincidences with each of these instances or incidents that took place. And the question that came to my mind is why is it that so many of the young men in our country are sad, hopeless, lost, without purpose? What's causing all this? You know what it is. It's an absence of faith. It's an absence of God in our culture. But it's absence of a lot of other things. We live in a society and a culture today that glorifies violence. It objectifies women. It calls good evil, evil good. It's just an upside down world. 75% of the suicides that take place in America today are men. There's something wrong. Interestingly enough, a large portion of those men had no fathers in their lives. The simple fact is we don't teach responsibility anymore. We don't teach accountability. The people that live in our country, we're alienated from our country. Our children don't even understand what it means to be an American. We're constantly inundated with victimology. Everybody's a victim. We don't know how to communicate with one another. Parents don't communicate with their children. Children are being raised without fathers. Children are raising themselves. And we're constantly being told, oh, that's okay. You don't need a father. We need a father. We need a father in the home. It's very important. And when we don't have a father in the home, then the fathers in the homes need to reach out to the kids in the community and try their best to help them. One of the issues that we have, and you hear about this all the time from the feminist movement and leftists, they say we have too much toxic masculinity. Now, I would contend that we don't have enough toxic masculinity. I don't think we have enough of it. What's wrong with having a strong disciplinary character? What's wrong with having a strong disciplinary leader in the home that can set examples and provide guidance to these young men? I don't think there would be anywhere near the violence that you see in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles if there were more fathers in the homes. Our young men have been led to believe, and not just our young men, but our young daughters as well, but in particular young men, have been led to believe that fun and happiness are the same thing. It's not. Fun is temporary. It's what I used to do when I would hang out with my friends and we would play video games, or we'd play pick up basketball or something like that, or go fishing. That was fun. But happiness is an entirely different thing, and happiness comes from spending quality time with people that matter, with things that have purpose. Happiness comes from feeling, when you fulfill voids in your life with substance. You got to fulfill it with substance, not just these temporary highs. When you do that, you'll find some measure of happiness. Our youth today, especially our young men, they're void of any purpose whatsoever. I mean, how do we correct this? How do we move in a different direction? I'm not entirely sure of what the answer is, but I think one of the things is by putting a stronger emphasis on the family. There's a lot of young men are out there on the margin, on the fringe. We need to try to help them find hope, faith. We need to try to give them a family. We need to try to help them find meaningful work and purpose in their life. Volunteering is something that we see that really helps a lot of people find happiness and a sense of satisfaction and gratification in their life. Healthy hobbies, things of that nature, things that give you a sense of belonging. These are the things that will help our youth find happiness. But playing video games all day is not going to do that. They're not going to find it in video games. They're not going to find it in politics. They're not going to find it in social media. They need purpose. They need real connections in their life. And in my opinion, the only way they're going to be able to get it is if some of us adults start leading them in the right direction. That's all the time we have for today's program, but I appreciate you for tuning in. And until next time, I'm Brian Moore, reminding you that from the rising of the sun to the going down of the same, the name of the Lord shall be praised.